Book Talk. We have a series of these that we do every semester, do them 2 or 3 times a semester. So keep watching for these. We need to keep coming. Words have the power to enlighten us or to darken our mind, to excite us or to give us fear. We can find words in books, and we've been instructed to seek learning through study and faith, even out of the best books. This series of A Book That Changed Me is to give an opportunity for people to share how the words in a book impacted them and ultimately how it increased their faith. And it's to encourage you to not be afraid to read and explore and ask questions and to delve into things and to discuss with others things that you have read. Our presenter today is Roger Wiblin of our history department. The book that changed him is The Country of My Skull. Brother Wiblin was born in Durban, South Africa. He grew up in apartheid South Africa and was in high school as major political and social changes occurred. He came to the United States on a ballroom dance scholarship to BYU in Provo. He traveled with their international tour team for 4 years. He graduated with a BA and an MA in history and met his wife, Heather, who was a Hoosier, and they have 5 children together. He received a PhD in history from Georgia State University. His dissertation, based on oral interviews that he conducted, are about the ballroom dance industry in Atlanta during the second half of the 20th century. Roger teaches public history and U.S. history, U.S. pop culture, and history education classes here on campus. His public history classes have annual exhibits that they do about local topics. If you haven't seen one of those are really interesting to go to. He is working on the book, A Flood of Memories, that is with another teacher, another person?
Yeah, faculty at BYU.
Okay. And they will be publishing their book next year. It's based on the Teton Dam. They have done extensive interviews with people coinciding with the anniversary of the flood there. And anyway, without further ado, we will turn time over to Brother Wiblin.
Thank you, Bill. Country of My Skull is an intensely personal story. It's intensely personal to me, and so my background and context is important. So I'm going to start a little with that, right? As Jolene told you, if this will work, there we go. I was born in Durban, South Africa. Durban's on the East Coast. Is it on? I'm sure it was on one of these maps. Here we go. Durban's somewhere up here. I can't see. My eyes are great. Anyway, I was born in Durban, South Africa. I was born at the height of apartheid. For those of you unfamiliar with apartheid, it was the National Party's racial policy. Essentially a complete separation of race groups. My family lived in a white neighborhood where Black Durbanites lived in a Black township outside of the city. Indian Durbanites lived in an Indian township, and coloreds, that's the official name for those of mixed races, lived in colored townships. I attended all-white schools. The neighborhood shopping malls were filled with white patrons. Black workers were generally in menial positions. In downtown Durban, there was a racial mix of all race groups in the streets, but the restaurants were populated by white patrons. Indian Durbanites were sometimes customers in the store, but I don't remember really seeing Black patrons in most of the major stores in South Africa. This was the norm. Now, in 1948, the National Party won a majority in Parliament in South Africa. And in 1960, they declared, 1948, 1960, they declared independence from Britain. We had been a British colony. Declared independence, and apartheid became the absolute ruling system. Although, arguably, most of it was in place under the British anyway. So, Black organizations who sought equality were banned. Many organizations, including the African National Congress, the ANC, you're familiar with Nelson Mandela, there's a young Nelson Mandela who helped found the ANC, turned to violent struggle to oppose the system. The South African government co-opted the military, the police and the military, to retain control in the country. They created so-called homelands. If I actually go back a slide, these colors here that you see over here, these are homelands that created essentially random pieces of ground that they said, we're going to say this is the Zulu home territory. This is the Xhosa home territory, the Venda home territory, right? Not actually necessarily historically connected to them. Some of them were, but not all of them. Black South Africans had been forced into the cash economy in the early 20th century already by British mining corporations. The government demanded that taxes be paid in cash, which forced men out of their rural homes and into mines or cheap industrial labor. In the late 1980s, apartheid began to fall apart. I was in high school when major changes began. The first black student in my high school, Benwood Boys High School, yes, all boys, arrived when I was in 10th grade. In that same year, Nelson Mandela was released from prison in South Africa. And this is all in the context that growing up, we had terrorist drills all through my childhood in case there was a terrorist attack in our schools, bomb drills. An hour away from our home, intertribal and interpolitical party violence killed Black South Africans daily. Marches and protests were violently put down by the police in tandem with the South African Defence Force, the SADF. This is a terrible and traumatic period in the history of my homeland. Now, I was blessed in many ways with my experience in South Africa. First, I was born and raised in an English-speaking state. So Natal, what is now KwaZulu-Natal, had been a British colony, so it was English-speaking. English-speaking states were more liberal. That's all relative, right? We're more liberal than Afrikaans-speaking states. So that Natal and the Cape Province tended to be more liberal. Secondly, I was blessed to have a history teacher in high school who was unafraid of talking about politics that was occurring in the present. It was not quite illegal, but it wasn't quite legal either. It's kind of this hazy middle ground. But Lloyd Camp, this is Lloyd, helped a bunch of 14 and 15-year-old boys recognize that the country's history was all sunshine and happiness. He made me ponder what life was like for black boys of my age at that time in just an hour away, essentially, from where I lived. This focus on empathy has impacted how I approach the classes that I teach. Many of you in my classes, you know I talk about empathy, right? Thirdly, ballroom dance in South Africa became integrated quicker than society at large did. So as a teenager, my parents blessed me by taking us to competitions that were run by Black organizations. So this is both these pictures, this is my younger sister that I was dancing with. So we went to competitions where the floors were mixed, right? The judging panels were mixed. There were white, black, Indian, all dancing on the floor. This is about 10 years before that major integration happens within South Africa as a whole, right? Finally, I was blessed to grow up in the church. While clearly the church has a troubled history when it comes to race, in my living memory, that was not the case. My father was the branch president of the first Indian branch in South Africa. We attended church in an Indian township. The children I was with in primary there were Indian. I didn't think much of it, as that was just how life was. In the mid-1980s, missionary work amongst the Black population in South Africa blossomed. And our ward was multiracial, particularly as Black domestic servants, maids, and sometimes their families who lived on the property of white homeowners, right, were converted and came to church. Black wards were created. Our stake became multiracial. This is at a primary activity. That's me. I must have been talking about Germany because I'm in later. But fake ones, not real ones. But you can see this is a multiracial. I was blessed that the church was multiracial, right? So I was blessed to come with these different perspectives. When I arrived in the United States to start university, the pathway to true democracy had already started in South Africa. I returned home after my freshman year and I went to vote in the first multiracial democratic election in South Africa. This is actually a line of voters waiting to get in the poll. Into the polls, right? In various places they were like that. So the first time that Black South Africans could vote. And so I went home for my brother's wedding, I voted in that election, and I returned to school, and then I went to serve my mission in Tennessee. Now, shortly after South Africa, the African National Congress takes power, The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created by an act of Congress. That happened, not Congress, I'm speaking American, Parliament is a year, in 1995. Between 1986 and 1998, the TRC conducted most of its hearings and investigation. It would technically take until 2003 to create the final report, as opposed to the interim report that was published in 1998. But there are three committees in the TRC. The first is the Human Rights Violation Committee. And the Human Rights Violation Committee mostly covered victims and perpetrators testifying of how they had experienced or committed acts of violence. The second committee was the Amnesty Committee, which read submissions from applicants and made decisions on who would be given full amnesty. The third group was the Rehabilitation Committee. This committee worked on finding ways to help victims recover or cope with the trauma that apartheid had brought. Now, I was on my mission for part of the time the commission functioned, and the rest of the time there's sparse news in the United States about it. And surprise, the internet was not actually a huge thing at that time, people. And so there was sparse availability of news about it. But Antjie Krog, who authored the book that I'm talking about today, was actually born in the Orange Free State, which was an Afrikaner nationalist state. Her mother was a poet and her father was a farmer. She, however, was incredibly liberal. By the age of 17, she had published her first collection of poetry and won the international awards for her poetry. She got her BA and MA and her teaching certificate at a university in South Africa. She was sympathetic to the ANC and the Freedom Front, those groups fighting for liberty, from early on in her life, despite her conservative upbringing, right? Her work clearly reflects her anti-apartheid stance, and the collection was republished by the African National Congress the year after it was published by a regular press, right? So they liked her work too. She's published multiple volumes of poetry, and she had journalism experience by the time she was requested and hired to serve as the South African Broadcasting radio journalist covering the TRC. So, in 1999, when I was at BYU, I was on the touring company. And that year we actually went to tour South Africa. I'd never been to South Africa before, so I got to go and tour with them. So I hadn't been home since 1994. I arrived, and to me there wasn't much different that was going on. Although I knew there were major social, political, and economic changes that had already happened. I was in a bookstore in Cape Town where we had done a show. And that was the first time I saw Country of My Skull. I had not heard about it. I'd heard Antjie Krog's name on and off, but that's the first time I heard this. When I picked it up, I read the back of the book and I was hooked. She writes so beautifully. On the back of the book, it says, "And I wade into song, in a language that is not mine, in a tongue I do not know. It is fragrant inside the song, and among the keynotes of sorrow and suffering, there are soft silences where we who belong in this landscape, all of us, can come to rest." She's talking about singing the new national anthem in South Africa. This spoke to me. As a white South African in the US, I often felt out of place because the images in the minds of many people that I met was either I couldn't truly be African because I'm white, or else I was somehow responsible for apartheid. This book seemed to offer insight into someone who felt similarly removed, perhaps even more so because she's an Afrikaner. I finished the tour and returned to the US with the book. It took me another 6 months to start reading the book, mainly because I had brain surgery in between, right? And this is how we learned that Roger is not attractive bald. Anyway, thank goodness for good genes, right? So Krog's book is in a sense an autobiography. So it's very autobiographical and I think for me, easy to relate to. Now, each time I read Country of My Skull, I learn something new about myself and about the content. This to me is the characteristic of a good book. There are few books I go back to and reread. Certainly in literature, I reread Harry Potter all the time, right? And I find you lose some more indications of J.K. Rowling's genius in knowing the end from the beginning, which I think is astonishing. I assigned my History 121 students, a bunch of you here, the Watson's Guide to Birmingham, which we discuss next week, but isn't it? No, we discussed it already. Sorry, we discussed it a couple of weeks ago. I love it for many reasons, but every time I reread it, I find that my empathy for the characters grows, even for Larry Dunn. Oh, you pretty much know Larry Dunn, the school bully, right? And I recognize the complexity of life for Black Americans in the 1960s. Juliet Memains, who's a dance scholar, Her appraisal of the US ballroom dance industry in a book called Glamour Addiction provokes me to write the counter-narrative every time I read it. It pushes me to think about what my contribution to my field is. Country of My Skull is a book that brings new insight with each reading. The material, however, is too heavy for me to read every year. While I love it, it's a challenging book, and I can only read it every few years. Now, while discussing disturbing material, as well as highly personal feelings and thought, Kroch writes beautifully. I've learned that even ugly things can be written about beautifully. Country of My Skull is written as a mix of academic writing, quoting of testimony, poetry, she's a poet, right, and news reporting rolled into one beautiful and at times haunting product. There are numerous sections that demonstrate Kroch's style, but I'll mention just a couple today. In writing about one of the hearings, I don't know why I have this as, okay, there we go. In writing about one of the hearings in the northern province of South Africa, taking place in the hall next to Louis Trichardt Sports Ground, right? So there's a sports ground, there's a hall that's been temporarily put up where the TRC is having hearings. Kroch writes about that experience. By late morning, a cricket match commences on the field next to the hall. And it is clear that the more things change on this side of the Soutpansberg, those are mountains, the more they stay the same. While the commission is listening to testimony of human rights violations, cheerful white families with their Tupperware, their sun hats, and their small town familiarity spend the day picnicking on the grass outside. Their children chase each other around the buckies, those are pickup trucks. Caught between the field and the hall, we in the media sit listening to bitter crying and choked words, interspersed with cheering and applause from an enthusiastic cricket crowd. The division carries through the police patrolling the showgrounds. The white policemen loll about watching cricket, while their black colleagues stand solemnly in the doorways of the halls, listening to the testimony. My hands on the laptop keyboard are numb with contradiction. This picture that she paints with her words is beautiful, even as she points out the racial contradictions surrounding interest in the TRC. When writing about testimony of torture, she is direct, her tone newspaper-like. As she discusses that testimony, however, she talks about how she is impacted emotionally and intellectually. There's an urgency in this part of her writing, an urgency to understand why the inhumanities went on for so long in a country that had so much potential. The reader can see this, especially when she writes about the chairman of the commission, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So at one point in the TRC process, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's the chairman, had a heart attack, right? And so he ends up in hospital. The media are allowed to visit him in hospital, but only once en masse. They all go into his hospital room. I think I put him up there, right? There he is. So, but Ike Kroch recognizes the important position that Tutu plays, right? She writes this: "There he lies, and I catch my breath. This wonderful man whose presence I always experienced humanity at its fullest. Humanity as it was meant to be. This man who has made sense for us of the torturous process of dealing with the truth by illuminating with insight, humor, and hope. And here he lies, smaller than I remember, and without his purple robe and wooden cross, but in ordinary rough hospital pajamas. He looks so worn and gray. My whole face is suddenly awash with tears. We cannot finish what we have started without this man. The cameras click away. Everyone is ushered out. I turn back and hold his hand. He smiles at me. Don't look so concerned. I'll be okay. Besides, we're fighting most on the same side of the angels." Her personal longing for Tutu's health as a means of bringing light to the flawed TRC process is moving. She switches between these tones in her writing, and it's powerfully revealing of her perspectives on what she writes. Now, as Kroch is a poet as well, I should also point out the beauty of her poems, which she especially deploys at times when she needs to leave the TRC to get away from the trauma that is associated with, which I'll talk about in a minute, to find peace and to restore her soul. So one of the poems that she uses this. In die winter word die mamot die wind. Sy trek aan haar boerlyf 'n kombers waarvan sy hou. Aan die spits is daar rotse en 'n optog soos 'n ruggraat. 'n Optog van engele, die berge voor my oë. Which is really beautiful, but you probably want to know what the heck that is. Anyway, so this is a poem about the Maluti Mountains, which are actually in Lesotho, which is within South Africa, right? In the winter, the Malutis are white. She puts on a blanket that she likes. At the top, there are cliffs in a procession like a spine, a march of angels. The mountains feed my eyes. Kroch's ability to meld these different techniques into a compelling account allows the reader to come to know her and to feel what she feels. Again, a way to help us empathize. Country of My Skull starts with an astonishing chapter in which Kroch masterfully drops the reader into a personal family context, the political complexity of South Africa's new democracy, and the start of the TRC. It is the mass of first-person testimony from the TRC that impacted me the most on my first read, and still impacts me every time I read the book. To read the horrific experiences of the victims and the perpetrators is at times a hard thing to do, but this is the strength of the book. The reader is exposed to varied and varying accounts of events in the dark history of the country. There is power in telling your story. As I've read Country of My Skull, I recognize now that this is one of the seminal moments that I was drawn to oral history. While hard to read or hear, the direct accounts from those that experience things draws me in. I feel the emotional power of a torture victim as he testifies of his torture in front of the policeman who tortured him and destroyed his life. I recognize the insincerity of the monotone apologies of South African Defence Force brutalists, or in the manufactured expression of remorse that an event took place, but not personal remorse for the actions that were performed by subordinates under Winnie Mandela, if you know Winnie Mandela, and the Mandela United Football Club, who have actually basically her goons to go and kill people. The power of words from the mouth of the witness hit me in this book in ways it had never before. While Testimony of the TRC is not oral history, it is a historic record that can be read similarly. It was more than 10 years later that I recognized my love for oral history and used it as a primary source for my dissertation, my research on youth ballroom dance in Idaho and Utah, and in my upcoming book, well, co-authored, there we go, on the Teton Dam flood, shameless plug, I'll give it, okay. And in my history class, my public history class exhibits. By the way, I teach that class again in the spring, so come take my public history class, where we talk about oral history specifically. Analyzing the words of narrators gives personal insight into events. Reading across testimony allows us to find themes, parallels, incongruency, everyday life, unique experiences, and most of all, to feel what narrators experience. Oral history theory tells us that multiple perspectives make a stronger case in an argument. Now, there are many parallels between what Kroch writes about in regard to covering the TRC and principles of oral history. Chapter 7 is entitled, Two Women, Let Us Hear It in Another Language. It presents the testimony of a black woman targeted in an attack by the South African police. The other is a story of a white woman who was injured in an explosion set off by the ANC. Both are victims, but it is important to hear both perspectives. Similarly, Chapter 8 contrasts two accounts of the same event from two individuals involved in the murder of a policeman and the policeman's wife. The accounts are given, they're different. They're given in an attempt to demonstrate why the narrators are less responsible than others in the murder. So Kroch says they're actually telling two stories. Quote, the story and the understory. The matrix, the propelling force determining what is left out, what is used, how it's used. And at the heart of the force are the amnesty conditions. They all want to get amnesty. They want to not go to jail. Today, they gave rise to a long description of who gave the orders to create a context for political motivations, and then the gory finer details of the murder to create the impression of full disclosure. But there's also the invisible audience, the imagined audience on the horizon somewhere, the narrator's family, colleagues, the new government, and every listener decodes the story in terms of their truth. Telling is therefore never neutral, and the selection and ordering try to determine the interpretation. Oral history posits this as a factor in how people tell their stories. I hope you history students recognize there is no such thing as objectivity in history. Every source that you read, no matter who it's written by, when it was written, it is subjective. We all come from different backgrounds, experiences, geographic locations, time periods. In addition, there are motivations for why people portray themselves in specific and other people in specific ways in oral history and any source, right? Now, in addition, my personal perspective as a listener impacts the meaning. I see in the testimonies. After listening to days of testimony by white Afrikaner leaders who refused to take responsibility for the atrocities of apartheid, Auntie Kroch again questioned her identity and self. Quote, what do I do with this? They are as familiar, because these are white men who are talking, they are as familiar as my brothers, cousins, and school friends. Between us all, distance is erased. Was there perhaps never a distance except the one I built up with great effort within myself over the years? And then this important observation. In a sense, it is not these men, but a culture that is asking for amnesty. I am powerless to ignore what vibrates in me. I abhor and care for these 5 men. And guess what? It's okay to feel both of those things at the same time. Now, noted oral historian Valerie Yao wrote a now classic article entitled, Do I Like Them Too Much? In which she identified dangers in liking your narrators too much. There's the danger you might let them get away with ignoring tough questions or not asking them difficult questions because you don't want to risk your relationship. At times, I wonder if Koch actually has this problem with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the chairman of the TRC. She is awed by him and believes the commission couldn't function without his leadership, right? She interviews him a number of times. But to her credit, Koch asked the hard questions, most likely because she was concerned about the success of the TRC and because she was struggling with understanding what the commission meant to the nation and its individual citizens, she being one of those. On my most recent read, I recognized that the struggles oral historians go through, the dangers of the craft, are similar to journalists who cover the commission. The government had to bring in counselors to work with journalists. The counselors explained, you'll experience the same symptoms as the victims. You'll find yourself powerless, without help, without words. Another psychologist explained, the more you empathize with the victim, the more you become the victim. You display the same kinds of symptoms, helplessness, wordlessness, anxiety, desperation. But for some people, it is so unbearable being a victim that they become a perpetrator instead. You get rid of the pain by putting it into someone else. So be very aware of that. Throughout the TRC, there were sessions to help journalists cope with the trauma they felt as they were consistently exposed to traumatic stories from witnesses. Oral historians working on histories of trauma similarly often have to seek help to cope. Because they continually listen to people who do reprehensible things very often. Talking openly about these issues is important. Families, friends, and therapists become allies in helping individuals voice their frustration, anger, sadness. This helps oral historians think about their mental health. I hope all of you went and listened to Jane Clayson Johnson's devotional talk on Tuesday. It is phenomenal, one of the best devotionals I've ever listened to, right? And I hope you recognize the value of having a community to help you cope, which is something these individuals have to come to and understand. Now, even with its inherent difficulties, I have a picture of Valerie Yao. No, I didn't. It's Tutu. Okay, I don't know why he's up there. But even with its inherent difficulties, another lesson that Koch's book demonstrates is that part of writing and reading history is facing the ugly, disturbing specifics of people's lives head on. Country of My Skull has pages of direct testimony of victims describing being tortured or committing acts of torture. Victims go into detail of the depraved treatment they received for merely being suspected of supporting the liberation movement. Perpetrators, including names you won't know, these horrendous men, Dirk Coetzee, Jeffrey Benzine, talk about burning bodies in a fire pit for hours while they barbecue meat a few feet away and get drunk to try and medicate themselves. While disturbing and evil, these accounts lead the reader to feel. Sometimes it is anger at the undeserved violence innocent people receive, and guilty victims actually receive too. At other times, it's sorrow at the lasting impact of trauma imposed on human beings. Whatever the emotion, developing empathy and sympathy are based on feeling. We cannot hide our heads in the sand and pretend these things didn't happen in the world. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go and fill your reading with stories of trauma, right, and violence. But I also believe that willfully being ignorant of what is happening in the world, your nation and your community, and what has happened in the world, your nation and your community, leaves you less empathetic. Christ is the great empathizer. He saw people and recognized the difficult circumstances they were in. He lived in a society that was controlled by colonizers. He ministered to those struggling physically, emotionally, spiritually. He lifted them. He encouraged them. Understanding the trials others have experienced can help us love and serve better. I encourage you to read. Read the scriptures most of all, right? Which, by the way, are full of stories of suffering, violence, and spiritual trial. But also read newspapers, listen to the radio, listen to podcasts, be aware of people. Seek the Spirit to help you know the needs of those suffering. Sometimes all people need to know is that they're seen and you know their situation. Now, another division that Koch talks a lot about is language. Today, South Africa has 12 official languages. But under apartheid, white South Africans, even now to a degree, but not as much, white South Africans are divided by language. English was the colonial language and Afrikaans the language of the oppressors. This was a very real divide in South Africa. When my family moved to the Transvaal, which is a former Afrikaans state, right? Afrikaner state, they speak Afrikaans up there, I was starting third grade. I had to take a remedial Afrikaans class because in Natal, English-speaking state, we only started learning Afrikaans in third grade, whereas the Transvaal students started in first grade. My father put on the form for remedial Afrikaans that I was from the Republic of Natal, hence I didn't know how to speak Afrikaans, right? And so because of this language barrier, Kroch feels her heritage is threatened as Afrikaners testify of the obscene violence they committed against people, mostly Black South Africans connected with the ANC. Black leaders of the ANC, ANC is one group, the IFP is a different group, the SACP is another group, right? All those Black leaders spoke English in their testimonies. This amplified the idea that Afrikaans is the language of evil in South Africa. Interestingly, a psychologist working with TRC journalists said, I find the white journalists are carrying a lot of guilt. Have you asked yourself why more Afrikaner journalists are covering the Truth Commission than any other group? It's to compensate for their guilt. While journalists tend to put more into their involvement with the commission, to compensate for their guilt, white journalists tend to put more into their involvement with the commission, but it takes its toll. Throughout her book, Kroch analyzes the words of those who testify. The way people say things is sometimes as important as what they're saying. Kroch's transcription of the testimony of a man she calls the shepherd, his real name is Lekotsa, and her thick interpretation of what it means demonstrates that. Now, you will not be able to see this very well, but what you can see is what Kroch recognizes is that there's a rhythm to this testimony. That what he's actually doing is he's essentially using poetic techniques in telling his testimony about how he was beaten by, and his family was destroyed by the South African police, right? So he tells of his mistreatment by the South African police, but the way that he tells it, that we can tell his priorities. His family heritage is central. His telling focuses on the loss of honor he and his family experienced as a result of this encounter. Kroch analyzes Lekotsa's use of metaphorical language, his rhetorical use of questions in his testimony, his desire for each side to understand others' cultural norms, and his understanding of death. Reading these testimonies and various interpretations of what they mean allows me to think about what I am missing as I speak to people, not only in my work as an oral historian, but as I listen to my family, my friends, my students, and acquaintances that I meet in everyday conversations. What are they really saying in the way they're saying it? What are they really telling me? Now, there's power in people telling their stories and others hearing those stories. As Kroch puts it, quote, now that people are able to tell their stories, the lid of the Pandora's box is lifted. For the first time, these individual truths sound unhindered in the ears of all South Africans. The Black people in the audience are seldom upset. They have known the truth for years. The whites are often disconcerted. They didn't realize the magnitude of the outrage, the depth of depravity, as Tutu calls it. Here she identifies a key element of the TRC experience. There was always a racial disparity in how people experienced apartheid, right? This is a racial breakdown of the South African population during the time of apartheid. You'll notice that 80% of the population is Black, right? But they're governed by a white government. Listening to people, Black and white, talk about the impact of the system on their lives, Kroch felt a new connection. She says, for me, it's a new beginning. It's not about skin color, culture, language, but about people. The personal pain puts an end to all stereotypes. Where we connect now has nothing to do with group or color. We connect with our humanity. Now, Tutu is credited with helping the mission make it to the end, eventually, right? He was forceful at times, but always looked to find ways to help perpetrators acknowledge their wrongdoing without condemning them, or calling them liars, which many of them were. But after the rather lackluster submission from political parties in which they essentially took no responsibility while saying they accepted responsibility, Kroch is infuriated. She goes to Tutu and he says, weren't you irritated that you had to listen to 4 versions of South Africa's past from these 4 different groups? He spreads out his 4 skinny fingers under my nose. 4 versions. 4 exist of the life of Christ. Which one would you have liked me to chuck out? Tutu's vision of reconciliation was based on the concept of Ubuntu. If you ever heard of Ubuntu, right? It's this concept that a person is basically not an independent, solitary entity. Rather, a person is human precisely in being enveloped in the community of other human beings, in being caught up in this bundle of life. To be is to participate. Tutu wanted society to move away from racial distinctions to recognition of a human identity. This would allow South Africans to create new identity by recognizing every person's humanity. Thabo Mbeki, on the other hand, Mandela's vice president and successor, differed markedly from Tutu over the idea of reconciliation. Where Tutu believed reconciliation should be meaningful connections between people of all races, Mbeki wanted an African Renaissance led by blacks, with white peacefully and passively coexisting. Even in the idyllic future Mbeki focused on, it was about racial difference. I love Kroch's conversation with a US professor visiting the TRC. And she writes, conjured up an unexpected picture of reconciliation. So this is what this US professor said. True reconciliation in America was visible when we saw on television how whites and blacks together looted a furniture shop during the 1992 Rodney King riots. You cannot carry furniture alone, and they simply work together in self-interest. That unified self-interest was not evident to the professor in the South Africa case. The hearings highlighted the issue of perpetrators, victims, and beneficiaries. People of all race groups fit into those categories depending on the context. Thus, in a sense, while the hearings were clearly about race, they were also a way to try to demonstrate that perhaps we are all more similar than we imagine as we manufacture differences based on physical attributes. Perhaps most of all, I empathize with Kroch's search for meaning as she tries to understand her connection as a white South African to a new changed South Africa. At one point she asks, where does a liberal white South African fit into the guilt, the responsibility, and the rebuilding? While Kroch is a generation older than I am, these thoughts are poignant and meaningful to me. When I arrived in the US in 1993, I was defensive of the country. The country I was raised in. While I recognize the unjust and evil system apartheid was, I felt no responsibility, nor do I today, by the way, for the actions of those who committed atrocities under apartheid. Hearing the stories of the victims, whether black, white, Indian, or colored, however, left me appalled at the lack of humanity in people, and how desperate some people are to have power, even if it means destroying others. Average-seeming South Africans committed acts of unspeakable wickedness. What happened in the police station around the corner from my childhood home? What should I make of the adults who surrounded me, who I know didn't support the system, but certainly benefited from that system? I'm not quite sure of the answers to those questions, just as Kroch has yet to make peace with her own family's role in that system. The power of good and evil was on full display at the TRC. Respectable individuals who lived seemingly normal lives in their neighborhoods and churches were also murderers and rapists who committed acts of violence to amass personal power and enforce their own vision of how South African society should function. Kroch's book leads to questions more than answers. By the end of the book, Kroch finds her connection to the motherland. While doing a call in on her telephone to a radio station, she's doing a radio report. She stands on a stone wall trying to get better cell reception. And suddenly she was sure. She says, there is a rawness in my chest. It is mine. I belong to that continent. My gaze, my eyes are one with the thousands of others that have looked back over the centuries toward Africa. Ours, mine. Yes, I would die for this. It slips out like a smooth, holy sound. And I realize that it is the commission alone that has brought me that moment of fierce belonging, unquote. While the TRC has not brought me that moment of fierce belonging, Country of My Skull has changed me. I'm a better historian, yes, but I'm a more empathetic man, a more thoughtful human being, an African American coming to terms with my past and my former homeland's history. This is part of the power of history and of reading. We can learn from what others have done. We can identify good and evil. We can empathize with all those involved, even the wicked ones, as we understand but not accept or validate their motivations and actions. I have wondered recently about the coincidence that my skull was opened to remove a growth in the same year that Country of My Skull was published. I'm grateful to have had this book come into my life. I'm grateful I faced difficult facts about my homeland and my people. I hope you have found, or will find, the book that makes you think, that moves you. a book that changes you. Thank you. No questions? Be inquiring people. Come on. Yes. Hey, I know you. It's Hunter.
I like what you said about like how the more you sympathize with the victim, like then you become. If you could elaborate on that, like some more thoughts you would have.
So it's really interesting because there's different ways that this goes. In oral history, we see it particularly, right? But this shows it too. The more you feel for a person, the more connected you become to them, right? So as they sat and listened to this, sometimes what would happen is these people always try to justify what they do, right? It's not like they're like, yes, I totally did it. I take blame for everything, right? There's pretty much no one who does that. And so listening to their justifications, there's a danger. You want to empathize with them and say, I understand the circumstances that led to that, right? But there's a danger that you're going to go to the extent of saying, oh, I took you should have done that. I get how you're doing it, right? So as you listen to these stories and understand people, when you have conversations with your roommates, when you have conversations with friends, you know them better because you have that connection, right? That's how it happens. You become more sympathetic, hopefully empathetic to them, right? So what Kroc says, that is important and vital, but also you have to be careful because if you buy into often the excuses for what they do, that's a problem, right? And in our personal lives, we can see that too, right? I can justify all kinds of things, right? Fortunately, my wife doesn't buy into it, and she's just like, yeah, you're a twit, stop that. So that's, the more we communicate and this is just truth, right? The more and why we need to get to know other people. Why, as members of the church, just as human beings, we need to reach out, right? And create more communities within a giant community. So I hope that answers the question. Where you go? Yeah, Mika.
You mentioned you're writing a book about the flood. I want to ask you, have you considered doing your own oral history investigations and research into, or maybe write about your own experiences of Parkgate?
No, because writing a book, dang, it's too much work. I mean, it's awesome and I love it, and this is going to be a fantastic book. But I'm blessed right now because I have a co-author, right? Fred Wibbs from the BYU Religion Department and I. It is a blessing to have a co-author. Writing a book is difficult. And my dissertation that hopefully will come into book form one of these days is somewhat takes this approach too, because it's informing. You as historians, right? You're informed by your own experiences. So whatever you're writing on it, you're informed by those experiences. So we try to be objective, right? By the way, you can never be objective, but you can be as objective as you can by recognizing your biases, right? And so that's a book that I hope to eventually finish, but it's about recognizing my biases. And I do feel there are certain people who I cannot stand that I interview. I'm like, how do I portray these people objectively in this book? And I'm like, you suck as a human being. But that's very Christ-like of me, right? Clearly I'm empathetic. But I'll repent. But so I would like to South Africa. The South African context is a totally different context. What is interesting to me about my experience, you should all be interested in your own experiences, right? Is coming from one background going to the other, right? This transition that I think, and as an immigrant, I feel that for immigrants, right? So I think there's power in that. So maybe someday, if some publisher comes and says, "Why didn't you write this book?" and I'll say, as long as I have 2 years to do it, it's fine. Gently.
So how'd you end up in Idaho? Why not like Tennessee or like?
I love the South, by the way. It's awesome. I ended up in Idaho because this is where the job was. So, and we are so glad we're here. So I'll tell you something. By the way, my wife's here too. We one of the things when we got married and as we talked about our futures, we were like, we both grew up outside of LDS centers, right? Heather's from Indiana, obviously from South Africa. And we see great value in that, right? Having to know what we believed and gain our testimonies because we were defending those testimonies in many ways, right? Often. And people were interested, which is great. And so we thought that would be great for our children to experience the same. And then the Lord said, hey, there's a great job in Idaho. And we're like, Utah and Idaho were not what we're looking for. But we knew this is where the Lord wanted us to be. So that's how we ended up. The Lord said, actually, a friend of ours said there's a job. And the Lord said, you need to go. So I applied for that. So and we love Idaho. Idaho was awesome. Every place has pros and cons. Lainey.
When you were talking about, I also feel the same way, like Idaho, what a place. Yeah, but, when you're talking about narrators and like trusting your narrators too much, kind of like on the opposite side of that, how can you be critical of a narrator without jumping to cynicism?
Okay, good. What that takes is it takes great listening skills and empathy, right? Part of that is finding commonalities with a narrator. So when I did I ended up doing 40 or 50 interviews for my dissertation, and when I went to do those interviews, I often didn't know the person very well, right? But I could find those connections, right? I'm like, we both dance, we both teach, right? So I could I get them to talk about those experiences, and that leads into the deeper questions that I can ask them, right? So it's a matter of saying, we have things in common, and everyone has problems. I have problems, people. So, and you have to recognize that you have issues too, right? I know you do, but everybody, you have to recognize they have issues, right? And that's what it is. And it's about empathy, right? It's being able to say, okay, I see your circumstances that you come from. I understand why you're that way. I still think you're a not nice person, right? But I understand. So it takes effort. It takes great effort to do that. And the reporters on this having to sit there and then give news reports trying to be neutral, whatever that means, right? That is a difficult task for them to do as well, that Paul writes about as well. And so it is difficult. It is intentional. You have to be very intentional about it, which makes all this issue difficult. Right? So, a fine question. Stop yawning, Caden. I'm kidding, yawn away. Yeah.
Considering that in parts of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, we're instructed to like judge righteously in the sense of removing ourselves from like personal biases, which is what we've already talked about to a degree. Would you say that being a member of the church has led you to be a less biased in general historian with your views and such?
Yes, but everything is impacted by background, right? So that's why I start with my biographic information, because I think the experience of living in the crazy country that I lived in, but being in the context of the gospel, demonstrated to me that you can love others despite what other people around you think, right? That I can, and perhaps even it took me a while to get to this point, right? To get to a point where you say terrorists who committed terrorist acts are still children of God, and I understand why they did it, because I want freedoms and liberties too, right? But the way they went about it is unacceptable, and the Lord would even say that's unacceptable, right? Well, the Lord gets to judge, I'm not the Lord. But I would think that he would say murder and torture and those things are unacceptable, right? So coming out of that, but for me, that was founded in the gospel because the church was that way in South Africa. I came out of that context. So for me, that is the context that I come from. It is a gospel-based context, right? That has informed that. But certainly, Christ is the great empathizer, right? And so the more I can empathize and be more like him, certainly that makes me a better person and a better historian. So yes, I would say everything's found in Christ. I mean, in the end, it's all found in Christ, right? Because he is the one that I want to be like, despite the Christ-like things I said earlier. Anyway, but you're right? I mean, the gospel should be a factor in helping us all be more empathetic, more do. And I hope it does, right? I mean, the gospel's full of empathy. Yes, and we learn from our past and we become more empathetic. Good. 2 more questions, then we're going to end.
Do you know why it's called Country of My Soul? Is it just like
It's
does it have meaning?
It has meaning to her. So it's a phrase that she uses. I should put that in as well. It's a phrase that she uses to demonstrate her connectedness to South Africa, right? And a lot of what happens is her understanding of South Africa has to do with what's in her head, right? So she's going to come to terms with these horrible things that have happened, and that her people, right, arguably her people, in the culture that she grew up in have done, and come to terms with does that make me separate from my country? Does that make it, not allow me to be? But what she comes to is that South Africa is, because it's the country of her soul, right? It's what's inside of her. It's what she feels inside her. So yeah, I should have put that in there. She does explain, but thank you for having me clarify. Okay. One more question. I feel like I'm teaching a lecture or something. Nathan,
This is not really about like most of the presentation, but like, how did you get into ballroom dancing? How what did you
how I got into ballroom dancing sitting right there. That's my mother over there. My mom's parents danced a lot. They went out social dancing, right? Did all kinds of things. My mother was a ballerina in her youth. She went to ballet school. And then she switched to ballroom because it's better. No, because it's different, right? And she was a very successful competitor in South Africa. So when I was about 12, my mother took the oldest 3 children. I have an older brother and sister as well. Took us all to have a lesson with her teacher. My mom hadn't danced. She stopped dancing when she had children, right? She stopped dancing. So it had been 15 years or so, maybe more, I don't know, since she had to dance. And so we went back and all 3 of us took a lesson, and I was the only one who stayed with it. So I started taking lessons and then started competing later on. And then my younger sister, just younger than me, who saw pictures of, she started dancing. So we started competing together. Conveniently, my other partner that I had aged out of the age category. My sister was the right age, so I worked that way. So my dad went to a dance studio to learn to dance, but really to find girls and meet girls. So he did, and he learned to dance, and he was competent. And fortunately, he found my mother, and I exist. So, but that's how I got into work, right? And that's what allowed me to come to BYU on a dance scholarship, and they paid for my school when I was on their team. So, but that is a great question. I'll talk about ballroom all day long if you want to. Anyway, thank you for coming. Remember, if you're in my class getting extra credit, write a paragraph about something you learned, something that stuck out to you, and email it to me by tomorrow night. Okay. Otherwise, I'll see you in class. Goodbye. Thank you for coming, everybody.